Hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part 5 of the series on Seshat, and just a quick review. So who was she? She was a very important goddess to do with accounting, geometry, astronomy, math, writing, essentially the goddess of the sciences or the academic scholarly works, record keeping. Now, for instance, see her with a palm front, she counted out the years of the pharaoh, all sorts of accounting, science just in general. And that's her symbol there now. This is from Temple Seti the First at Abydos. We see Seshat with Thoth. She's the female counterpart of Thoth. And as time went on, her role was eventually diminished, and essentially many of her roles was usurped by Thoth. But the further you go back, you find that she's actually not, if not the equal, the superior in many ways. So traditionally, Thoth is associated with writing. He taught writing to people. It was actually Seshat who invented it. Astronomy, maths, geometry, surveying, medicine, botany, weights and measures, architecture, knowledge, science in general, record keeping. Well, it's actually Seshat who was the primary one, the main one, in many ways. So geometry. She has many titles in the very old texts, and so mistress of the house of the architects, goddess of surveying, the mistress of the house of life, record keeping, librarians, foremost of the builders. So both in life, but also in the afterworld, netherworld, or would be I'm not sure the term. She'd also make your mansion in the afterlife as well. So weights and measures being connected to her. What's most important is this, what's called stretching the cord ceremony, where Seshat and the pharaoh, they bang two stakes into the ground with a loop of rope. This establishes not just the axis of the construction, but also the units of measurement, an important feature in regard to this as well. Very similar. Shenring, I mentioned that earlier, the rod and the ring, ancient systems, measurements and surveying tools. This would align it to north. So we'll cover that, but the importance of north and Seshat and this stretching the cord ceremony in the architecture. This is the oldest known surviving picture of a stretching the cord ceremony. It goes back to very, very old Cassicamway, and part of it is missing. Now, however, there are also written descriptions of it, but that's as a picture. Now you still get an idea of Seshat stretching the cord ceremony. So the Ptolemaic stone, for instance, lists various stretching the cord ceremony and connects them to Seshat. So all that piece is missing. We can be very confident that it's Seshat. Well, it's written in the Ptolemaic stone. Okay, so let's do a timeline. And we'll begin with, year 0. Let's note year 0. It's like either 1 BC or 1 AD, but the Ptolemaic period. Around about the year 30 BC, Egypt was annexed into the Roman Empire. Prior to that was what was the Ptolemaic period, and that comes as basically the Greek rulers of Egypt. So Alexander the Great conquered the known world, and when he died, his empire was split up. His generals each were granted a region, and Ptolemy, one of his generals, become the king of Egypt, and that's where Ptolemaic comes from. One of his descendants was the famous Cleopatra, as in Antony and Cleopatra, the last of the pharaohs of Egypt, queens of Egypt. Across Lower and Upper Egypt, there are several depictions of Alexander the Great being crowned as pharaoh, and that's an important feature because one of the powers of Egypt was even when the foreign rulers come in, they would become Egyptian, and they didn't bring in their own culture, religion, architecture. They became Egyptian, and so there you see, rather than a Hellenistic version, there's Alexander, and there's several other ones of him in these ceremonies across Egypt. But also, for instance, Com Ombo is one example. This is actually Ptolemaic era. This was built during the Ptolemies period. It has a famous calendar there as well. Temple of Hathor at Dendera, where the light bulbs are, but also the Dendera zodiac. That is also built during the Ptolemaic period, just one of them, and also includes the Seshat and the Pharaoh and the stretching the cord ceremony. Temple of Horus at Edfu, again Ptolemaic, and I think just important because even just the established Egyptian history covers 3,000 years. So uh, I think it's important to highlight that it covers a long period and that these other aspects were actually from much later. So the Parthenon had already been built by the time the Edfu, Kom and these other temples had been built. But at Temple Temple of Horus Edfu, we have the Pharaoh and Seshat stretching the cord ceremony. We also have what's called the Edfu texts, which describe the stretching the cord ceremony and how important it was. And so a lot of these Egyptian temples actually are Greek or Roman era constructions. But the stretching the cord ceremony, Seshat, and this is her symbol of the later period. We'll get to this because it changed over time, but what you have is just either 7 leaves or 7 petals, depending, and upside down horns. Okay, so Seshat. Okay, now prior to that you had the Persian conquest, Cambyses. Unlike other foreign rulers, Cambyses was no fan of Egyptian culture. He went out of his way to destroy sacred sites, destroy the important tombs, monuments, kill the sacred bull, and so the Persians went out of their way to destroy Egyptian culture. Now, prior to the Persian conquest, there's the Sate era, or the late dynastic period. A recent statue was found. It originally thought to be Ramses because of the size, but it was actually turned out to be Psamtik I, and it's the last, or one of the last, but the last known of these colossal stoneworking statues. So that's only around about 650 BC. Prior to that, what you had was the Kushite rule. The Kushites were foreigners, but they were still very Egypt. They were from the Nubians, or modern Sudan. Their religion, etc., was very similar to Egypt already. So although they were technically foreign rulers because they were above the cataracts, they were still very Egyptian and even so. The Nubian Book of the Dead is slightly different. However, they incorporated Heliopolis into it, which is way up here in Lower Egypt. So again, they incorporated Egyptian culture, respected it, and even though they had their own slight variations on these things, but that's just one of these foreign rulers. Now, prior to that, around about the year 1170 BC, you have what's called the Bronze Age collapse. So at that point, and we're moving backwards in time, so we'll get to the Battle of Kadesh, but at that time, the Hittites and the Egyptians had peace treaties, trade deals going on, lots and lots of trade moved between them. Egyptian rulers were writing letters to the Hittites. How's the mother? How's the father? Heard your kid broke his leg. Hope all is well. Did you get the perfume I sent you? Thanks for that shipment of dried fruit, etc., etc. Even Hammurabi. So you have these very personal letters. You have and not just a few, many of them across this entire region, including business receipts, trade deals, and very personal letters as well. So up to this point, the history it's not just relying on some Egyptian texts or some Hittite texts. Across that whole region, all the people are telling the same story. We can be very confident of that history to that point because everyone's backing each other up on that. There's a card anyway. That's just an illustration of it, but that's the Battle of the Nile Delta, where the Sea Peoples were defeated in one particular battle. But whether the Bronze Age collapse was because of the Sea Peoples in these invasions, now the Sea Peoples were moving on land as much as they were moving on the sea. So that's the term that's often given to them. But most of the army was travelling on land, and even the records, so the Great Harris Papyrus also describes them carrying their possessions on carts, and they brought their wives and children with them. It wasn't just like a invasion army; it was a mass migration in that sense. Now, whether the Bronze Age collapse was because of these armies moving around, environmental factors, or socio-political events, Eric Klein has written on this, lots of great lectures he has available on YouTube in regards to this. And as he says, it probably was a 1-2-3 punch rather than any one single factor, but a combination of all of these leading to the Bronze Age collapse. There was a collapse in trade, major construction projects for a couple centuries all stopped. Now, prior to the Bronze Age collapse, we get to Ramses the Great. These are some of the statues at Abu Simbel. Very egotistical, let's just say. Really liked stamping. So not only did he stamp his name, so there are many old hieroglyphs and writings, and then Ramses stamped his name on top, but underneath you can still see the old one. But also many of his works, original works as well, and are just monumental. Now this is a statue of Ramses. This is just one of them. It's actually not the biggest one, but just to get an idea of the colossal works. And so it was actually during the New Kingdom that the largest stones moved over. The Colossi of Memnon, for instance, were all in this New Kingdom period. So yeah, awesome stonework, massive weights, moved massive distances, but they are in this period of the New Kingdom. Now, if you want to see, so trilithons of Baalbek, they're rectangular blocks of limestone. Okay, this is Ozymandias Colossus by Ramses II. This weighed more than the heaviest trilithon at Baalbek, and it was a statue, and it was upright. So the trilithons are laying on their side. They're only moved half a mile, either essentially across, depending on where they come from, the trilithons come from the quarry. It was either one fraction of a degree uphill or a couple of degrees downhill, and half a mile. Ozymandias Colossus was a statue lifted upright, so it was much higher than it was wide, and it weighed more than all of them, and it was a beautifully carved statue. Ozymandias is the Greek pronunciation of Ramses II's throne name, and there's also that famous poem, which is based on there's a bit of some poetic license in the poem, of course, but he's describing this Ozymandias collection. Look on my works, you mighty in despair. Alright, so now Ramses II, he won the Battle of Kadesh. So I already mentioned previous, so moving backwards, that after Ramses, the Egyptians and the Hittites were writing letters to each other, sending each other gifts, lots and lots of trade going on. But this peace between the Hittites and the Egyptians began with what's called the Battle of Kadesh, which was won by Ramses II. All over Egypt, many temples, you'll see this picture. That's Ramses and celebrating the Battle of Kadesh victory. And there are also, again, many this is a peace treaty, and one of the example of these documents. So the peace treaty between the Hittites and the Egyptians. All this history is like very well recorded and cross-referenced. All the peoples in that area, they write letters to each other, and they wrote, so when they wrote a letter, he had to have existed at the same time as that person to have written that letter, or to have sent a business receipt, or a trade deal, or a peace treaty. So all this is very well established. Very well established. Father of Ramses II was Seti I, Temple of Seti I at Abydos, where you have his famous kings list. And this was around about the same time as the Turin canon. And this is in the New Kingdom, which is an important feature. But what you have is Seti I with his son Ramses II. Now, what's also interesting is the Temple of Seti I. You have many depictions of Seshat, and there we see. So this is a comparison with the Ptolemaic era one. You see the upturned horn, the upside down horns. But also there's a stretching the cord ceremony carving in there. Now in the screenshot I couldn't quite grab all of it, but we get a view above her head, and there we get it. The symbol of Seshat is slightly bit different there, because what we have in the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, we have both the new symbol of Seshat and the old symbol of Seshat. This is from the Old Kingdom, the Stele of Weponefret, and you also find it Palermo stone. So this is like an interesting point in history, and it's pretty much a period where the new symbol of Seshat emerges, and the Temple of Seti I, we see the old and the new there. So several kings in the New Kingdom era, but an important one probably should mention Tutmosis as well, but let's just for Hatshepsut. So, for instance, at Karnak and these mighty obelisks, the majority of them again were from this New Kingdom period. So the obelisks of Hatshepsut, Tutmosis, and others. So the single great pieces of stone, if you want to find in Egypt, were moved in the New Kingdom. And so she was a female pharaoh, and she was one of those pharaohs who's not mentioned by Seti I, and these are written out of the history in many ways, and her name often defiled, destroyed, or some cases. For instance, at Karnak, Tutmosis built a wall, which is to hide the name of Hatshepsut and her obelisk. But what we also have is Hatshepsut shown there as the king, doing the stretching the cord ceremony, and notice Hatshepsut, the symbol now, is the Old Kingdom, or the very old version of it. Prior to, from Seti I onwards, we have Seshat shown this way. Prior to that, that's the symbol of Seshat. Get a close up. Okay, also around about the time of the New Kingdom is where the Book of the Dead comes to the fore, also called the Book of Emerging Forth in the Light, a few other names. But the Book of the Dead is derived from the older coffin texts of the first intermediate, pardon the typo, and the coffin texts are derived from the even older pyramid texts. So just as with the King's List at Abydos, and the Turin Canon gets a little bit too much attention, I would say, at least if not put in perspective of where it comes from, the era, but the Book of the Dead. So the Book of the Dead was almost for everyone. Now the coffin texts were for nobility, and the pyramid texts were for the pharaohs, for the kings. But that's okay. So second intermediate period, where there was no united Egypt pharaoh king, time of civil war, warlords, that type of stuff, and with the New Kingdom, then we had united Egypt once again, time of civil war, strife, turmoil, the intermediate period. Before that, what's called the Middle Kingdom. Again, there were several pharaohs, but Senusret the first was an interesting one, because the oldest known surviving obelisk, which is around about 2000 BC, around about that time, is in Heliopolis, and that's has inscribed with his name and some of his victories. So Senusret also expanded the Egypt into foreign lands as well. And the founder of the New Kingdom was Mentuhotep II. Again, pardon the typo there. He died around about that time. But also that it begins with Mentu. That's the Egyptian god of war, Mentu. So whether it's Ret or Re, you'll find that other pharaohs will use Ra, Re at the end of their name. But prior to the New Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, where we had the first intermediate period, and again this time of strife, civil war, warlords, not a united Egypt, the kings during that time, for instance the father of Mentuhotep and his ancestors, would use the term Mentu. They would worship the god of war rather than try and connect their name through Re or Ret or Ra to the sun. The gods of the kings of that time were attaching themselves to the god of war. It was a time of civil war and strife. And okay, so Middle Kingdom, first intermediate period, civil war, strife, etc. And during that time, that's where we find the oldest surviving coffin text, and that's one of the names because these texts were written on coffins, and very similar to the Book of the Dead, but these were limited to the tombs of rich people, as where now everyone focuses on the kings. Joanna Fletcher does some lovely work. She looks into the details of normal Egypt, the commoners as well, and their burial ceremonies and rituals, but coffin texts from about the first intermediate period. So the Book of the Dead still very relevant. So, and just like the Ptolemaic temple, still very relevant. But just to get an idea that this is already covering a 2,000 year period. Okay, so first intermediate period, coffin text. Then we have the Old Kingdoms, this is sometimes called the Archaic period as well. But the Old Kingdom and early dynastic, or the Archaic period, these are not very well defined. So even amongst the Egyptologists, there's still a bit of a dispute exactly what this means. These are vague terms and not, and the history isn't quite as clear on the records on a lot of these things. However, what we find in the Palomo stone, we have records to the Sed festival, and we have records of Seshat and the stretching the cord ceremonies. But also the Palomo stone, which has a king's list up to Yunus. Now Yunus was the last king mentioned. He was the first king to have the pyramid text in his tomb, and so this is from Yunus. These are the pyramid texts. Yunus now on the Palomo stone, where we have these the late pre-dynastic kings. Now, the stone actually carries on further, so how many pre-dynastic kings there were. Now, these are not mentioned on the king's list at Abydos, they're not mentioned in the Turin canon, so that needs to be taken into account. So if you want to use those to make a case, well, okay, you need to include the Palomo stone. But for instance, Den, what we find, well, again, you see the symbol of Seshat there, but this particular piece is the stretching the cord foundation ceremony by the Seshat priests, the great door of a temple, throne of the gods. And there are other references throughout the Palomo stone to the stretching the cord ceremony. And it's also, so we have Dan, down here we have Kesekemwe, this is prior to Snefru. And again, if we see the Seshat symbol, the old, so these are from the older surviving documents. Kesekemwe, now I mentioned him earlier, but that's part of a door jamb. It was repurposed later, but it was found, this stone where we see the stretching the cord ceremony. Just a comparison there. And we also, of course, have it written as well. So the depictions, whether from the Ptolemaic back to this period, are coherent. Also, so priest Weponefret, that was one of the priests of Seshat. We have a slab stealer across the western cemetery in Giza, where all the high officials were born. Sign of the scribe and architects, and of course Seshat. So he was an overseer of the record keepers, and the scribes being the keepers of the records. And we see a comparison. Seshat. Even like in Budge on his hieroglyph dictionary, this symbol is for Seshat, but the goddess of wisdom. So Seshat from the very old period. Now also you could bring up the Scorpion II bowl, or King Nama, which also has those references there. I mentioned them in earlier ones. But I just want here to establish firstly a timeline of the stretching the cord ceremony in Seshat, as well as just to put the Book of the Dead and the Abydos Kings lists and that into a perspective. And you see from over this 3,000 year period of well recorded, well established history, and the documents which are cross-referenced with, at least from the New Kingdom onward, immaculate connections to even other nations, writing each other letters, business deals, trade deals, receipts. If it was in a court of law, it would be a slam dunk. So at least up to that period. But even the Middle Kingdom and these intermediate periods, still it's not, we'd love to have more records, of course, but the story is quite coherent and blends itself to one another. One thing backs up the other. It's not as slapdash as what would often be said. But that's history from the Ptolemaic, stretching the cord way back to the Old Kingdom and archaic pre-dynastic period, and also the pyramid text, the coffin text, and then the Book of the Dead. But if I'm going to cover this, and in regards to what these pyramids, not just of Unas Pepi, as well as other kings, say. If you read the whole text, and I'll put some links up to that I'll get to that topic and put all the links up. Yeah, some very interesting writing, and at least raises some very interesting questions. So I just threw it, so lots of typos going on in here, but forgive me those. Anyway, a lot more to come on Seshat, and especially the stretching the cord ceremony and how it connects to these very old documents, such as the pyramid texts of Palomo stone and these lists going back quite some time. So with that, hope you enjoyed. More to come on Seshat, and a lot more actually to come. Cheers.